Chapter 11. Israel-Palestine, the real options. On July 13, 2013, former Shin Bet chief Yuval Diskin issued a dire warning to the government of Israel: either it would reach some kind of two-state settlement or there would be a shift to a nearly inevitable outcome of the one remaining reality, a state from the sea to the river. The near-inevitable outcome, one state for two nations, will pose an immediate existential threat of the erasure of the identity of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which would soon have a Palestinian Arab majority. On similar grounds, in Britain's leading journal of international affairs, two prominent Middle East specialists, Clyde Jones and Beverly Milton Edwards, write that if Israel wishes to be both Jewish and democratic, it must embrace the two-state solution. It is easy to cite many other examples, but unnecessary, because it is assumed almost universally that there are two options for mandatory Palestine: either two states, Palestinian and Jewish democratic, or one state from the sea to the river. Israeli commentators express concern about the demographic problem: too many Palestinians in a Jewish state. Many Palestinians and their advocates support the one-state solution, anticipating a civil rights, anti-apartheid struggle that will lead to secular democracy. Other analysts also consistently pose the options in similar terms. This analysis is almost universal, but crucially flawed. There is a third option, namely, the option that Israel is pursuing with constant U.S. support, and this third option is the only realistic alternative to the two-state settlement. It makes sense, in my opinion, to contemplate a future binational secular democracy in the former Palestine, from the sea to the river. For what it's worth, that is what I have advocated for 70 years. But I stress advocated. Advocacy, as distinct from mere proposal, requires sketching a path from here to there. The forms of true advocacy have changed with shifting circumstances. Since the mid-1970s, when Palestinian national rights became a salient issue, the only plausible form of advocacy has been as a staged process, beginning with a two-state settlement. No other path has been suggested that has even a remote chance of success. Proposing a binational, one-state, settlement without moving on to advocacy in effect provides support for the third option, the realistic one taking shape before our eyes. Israel is systematically extending plans that were sketched and initiated shortly after the 1967 war, and institutionalized more fully with the accession to power of Menachem Begin's Likud party a decade later. The first step was to create what Yonatan Mendel has called a disturbing new city, still named Jerusalem, but extending far beyond historic Jerusalem, incorporating dozens of Palestinian villages and surrounding lands, and now designated as a Jewish city and the capital of Israel. 3 All of this is in direct violation of explicit Security Council orders. A corridor to the east of this new Greater Jerusalem incorporates the town of Ma'ale Adumim, established in the 1970s but built primarily after the 1993 Oslo Accords, with lands reaching virtually to Jericho, thus effectively bisecting the West Bank. Corridors to the north incorporating the settler towns of Ariel and Kadumim further divide what is to remain under some degree of Palestinian control. Meanwhile, Israel is incorporating the territory on the Israeli side of the illegal separation wall, in reality an annexation wall, taking arable land and water resources and many villages, strangling the town of Qalqilia, and separating Palestinian villagers from their fields. In what Israel calls the seam between the wall and the border, close to 10% of the West Bank, anyone is permitted to enter, except Palestinians. Those who live in the region have to go through an intricate bureaucratic procedure to gain temporary entry. Exiting, for example, in order to receive medical care, is hampered in the same way. The result, predictably, has been severe disruption of Palestinian lives and, according to UN reports, a decrease of more than 80% in the number of farmers who routinely cultivate their lands and a decline of 60% in the total yield of olive orchards, among other harmful effects. The pretext for the wall was security, but that means security for illegal Jewish settlers. About 85% of the wall runs through the occupied West Bank. Israel is also taking over the Jordan Valley, thus fully imprisoning the cantons that remain. Huge infrastructure projects link settlers to Israel's urban centers, ensuring that they will see no Palestinians. Following a traditional neo-colonial model, a modern center remains for Palestinian elites in Ramallah, while the remainder of the population mostly languishes. To complete the separation of Greater Jerusalem from remaining Palestinian cantons, Israel would have to take over the E1 region. So far that action has been barred by Washington, and Israel has been compelled to resort to subterfuges, like building a police station there. Obama is the first U.S. president to have imposed no limits on Israeli actions. It remains to be seen whether he will permit Israel to take over E1, perhaps with expressions of discontent and a diplomatic wink to make it clear that these are not seriously intended. There are regular expulsions of Palestinians. In the Jordan Valley alone, the population has been reduced from 300,000 in 1967 to 60,000 today, and similar processes are underway elsewhere. Following policies that go back a century, each action is limited in scope so as not to arouse too much international attention, but they have a cumulative effect and intent that are quite clear. Furthermore, ever since the Oslo Accords declared that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity, the U.S. Israeli duo have been committed to separating the two regions. One significant effect is to ensure that any limited Palestinian entity will have no access to the outside world. In the areas that Israel is taking over, the Palestinian population is small and scattered and is being reduced further by regular expulsions. The result will be a greater Israel with a substantial Jewish majority. Under this third option, there will be no demographic problem and no civil rights or anti-apartheid struggle, nothing more than what already exists within Israel's recognized borders, where the mantra Jewish and democratic is regularly intoned for the benefit of those who choose to believe, oblivious to the inherent contradiction, which is far more than merely symbolic. Unless achieved in stages, the one-state option will prove to be an illusion. It has no international support, and there is no reason why Israel and its U.S. sponsor would accept it. The question, often raised, of whether the hawkish Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would accept a Palestinian state is misleading. In fact, his administration was the first to countenance this possibility when it came into office in 1996, following those of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, which rejected it. Netanyahu's director of communications and policy planning, David Bar-Ilan, explained that some areas would be left to Palestinians, and if they wanted to call them a state, Israel would not object, or they could call them fried chicken. His response reflects the operative attitude of the U.S.-Israeli coalition to Palestinian rights. The United States and Israel call for negotiations without preconditions. Commentary in both countries and elsewhere in the West typically claims that the Palestinians are imposing such preconditions and so hampering the peace process. In reality, it is the United States and Israel that insist upon crucial preconditions. The first is that negotiations must be mediated by the United States, whereas any authentic negotiations would, of course, have to be in the hands of some neutral state with a degree of international respect. The second precondition is that a legal settlement expansion must be allowed to continue, as has happened without a break during the 20 years following the Oslo Accords. In the early years of the occupation, the United States joined the world in regarding the settlements as illegal, as confirmed by the UN Security Council and the International Court of Justice. Since the Reagan years, their status has been downgraded to a barrier to peace. Obama has weakened the designation further, to not helpful to peace. Obama's extreme rejectionism did arouse some attention in February 2011, when he vetoed a Security Council resolution supporting official U.S. policy, which calls for the ending of settlement expansion. As long as these preconditions remain in force, diplomacy is likely to remain at a standstill. With brief and rare exceptions, that has been true since January 1976, when the United States vetoed a Security Council resolution, brought by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, the Green Line, with guarantees for the security of all states within acknowledged and stable borders. That is essentially the international consensus that is by now universal, with the two usual exceptions. The consensus has been modified to include minor and mutual adjustments on the Green Line, to borrow official U.S. wording before it had broken with the rest of the world. The same is true of any negotiations that may take place in Washington or take place elsewhere overseen by Washington. Given these preconditions, little can be achieved other than letting Israel carry forward its project of taking over whatever it finds valuable in the West Bank and the Syrian Golan Heights, annexed in violation of Security Council orders, while maintaining the siege of Gaza. One can, of course, hope for better, but it is hard to be optimistic. Europe could play a role in advancing the world's aspirations for a peaceful diplomatic settlement if it were willing to pursue an independent path. The European Union decision to exclude West Bank settlements from any future deals with Israel might be a step in this direction. U.S. policies are also not graven in stone, though they have deep strategic, economic, and cultural roots. In the absence of such changes, there is every reason to expect that the picture from the river to the sea will conform to the third option. Palestinian rights and aspirations will be shelved, temporarily at least. If the Israel-Palestine conflict is not resolved, a regional peace settlement is highly unlikely. That failure has far broader implications, in particular for what U.S. media call the gravest threat to world peace, Iran's nuclear programs. The implications become clearer when we look at the most obvious ways to deal with the alleged threat and their fate. It is useful, first, to consider a few preliminary questions. Who regards the threat as being of such cosmic significance? And what is the perceived threat? The Iran threat is overwhelmingly a Western obsession. The non-aligned countries, most of the world, have vigorously supported Iran's right, as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, to enrich uranium. In Western discourse, it is commonly claimed that the Arabs support the U.S. position regarding Iran, but the reference is to Arab dictators, not the general population. Also standard is reference to the standoff between the international community and Iran, to quote from the current scholarly literature. Here the phrase international community refers to the United States and whoever happens to go along with it, in this case, a small minority of the international community, but many more if political stands are weighted by power. What then is the perceived threat? An authoritative answer is given by U.S. intelligence and the Pentagon in their regular reviews of global security. They conclude that Iran is not a military threat. It has low military expenditures even by the standards of the region and limited capacity to deploy force. Its strategic doctrine is defensive, designed to resist attack. The intelligence community reports no evidence that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, but if it is, they conclude that would be part of Iran's deterrent strategy. It is hard to think of a country in the world that needs a deterrent more than Iran. It has been tormented by the West without respite ever since its parliamentary regime was overthrown by a U.S.-British military coup in 1953, first under the harsh and brutal regime of the Shah, then under murderous attack by Saddam Hussein with Western support. It was largely U.S. intervention that induced Iran to capitulate in its war with Iraq, and shortly after, President George H.W. Bush invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for training in advanced weapons production, an extraordinary threat to Iran. Iraq soon became an enemy of the United States, but meanwhile Iran was subjected to harsh sanctions, intensifying under U.S. initiative. It was also constantly subjected to the threat of military attack by the United States and Israel, in violation of the UN Charter, if anyone cares. It is, however, understandable that the United States and Israel would regard an Iranian deterrent as an intolerable threat. It would limit their ability to control the region, by violence if they choose, as they often have. That is the essence of the perceived Iranian threat. That the clerical regime is a threat to its own people is hardly in doubt, though regrettably it is hardly alone in that regard. But it goes well beyond naivete to believe that Iran's internal repression is much of a concern to the great powers. Whatever one thinks of the threat, are there ways to mitigate it? Quite a few, in fact. One of the most reasonable, as I have said elsewhere, would be to move toward establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Arab states and others call for immediate moves to eliminate weapons of mass destruction as a step toward regional security. The United States and Israel, in contrast, reverse the order and demand regional security, meaning security for Israel, as a prerequisite to eliminating such weapons. In the not very remote background is the understanding that Israel, alone in the region, has an advanced nuclear weapons system and also refuses to join the NPT, along with India and Pakistan, both of whom similarly benefit from U.S. support for their nuclear arsenals. The connection of the Israel-Palestine conflict to the alleged Iranian threat is therefore clear. As long as the United States and Israel persist in their rejectionist stance, blocking the international consensus on a two-state settlement, there will be no regional security arrangements, hence no moves toward establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone and mitigating, perhaps even ending, what the United States and Israel claim to be the gravest threat to peace, at least to do so in the most obvious and far-reaching way. It should be noted that, along with Britain, the United States has a special responsibility to devote its efforts to establishing a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. When attempting to provide a thin legal cover for their invasion of Iraq in 2003, the two aggressors appealed to UN Security Council Resolution 687 of 1991, claiming that Saddam Hussein had violated the demand to end his nuclear weapons programs. The resolution also has another paragraph, calling for steps towards the goal of establishing in the Middle East a zone free from weapons of mass destruction, obligating the United States and United Kingdom even more than others to take this initiative seriously. These comments naturally leave out many urgent topics, among them the horrifying descent of Syria into suicide and ominous developments in Egypt, which are sure to have a regional impact. Nonetheless, this is how some of the core issues appear, to me at least. Chapter 12. Nothing for Other People, Class War in the United States. Norman Ware's classic study of the industrial worker appeared 90 years ago, the first of its kind. It has lost none of its significance. The lessons Ware draws from his close investigation of the impact of the emerging industrial revolution on the lives of working people, and on society in general, are just as pertinent today as when he wrote, if not more so, in the light of the striking parallels between the 1920s and today. It is important to remember the condition of working people when Ware wrote. The powerful and influential American labor movement that arose during the 19th century was being subjected to brutal attack, culminating in Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare after World War I. By the 1920s, the movement had largely been decimated. A classic study by the eminent labor historian David Montgomery is entitled The Fall of the House of Labor. The fall occurred in the 1920s. By the end of the decade, he writes, corporate mastery of American life seemed secure. Rationalization of business could then proceed with indispensable government support, with government largely in the hands of the corporate sector. It was far from a peaceful process. American labor history is unusually violent. One scholarly study concludes that the United States had more deaths at the end of the 19th century due to labor violence, in absolute terms and in proportion to population size, than any other country except Tsarist Russia. The term labor violence is a polite way of referring to violence by state and private security forces targeting working people. That continued into the late 1930s. I can remember such scenes from my childhood. As a result, Montgomery wrote, modern America had been created over its workers' protests, even though every step in its formation had been influenced by the activities, organizations, and proposals that had sprung from working-class life, not to speak of the hands and brains of those who did the work. The labor movement revived during the Great Depression, significantly influencing legislation and striking fear into the hearts of industrialists. In their publications, the industrialists warned of the hazard facing them from labor action, backed by the newly realized political power of the masses. Though violent repression did not end, it was no longer adequate to the task. It was necessary to devise more subtle means to ensure corporate rule, primarily a flood of sophisticated propaganda and scientific methods of strike-breaking, developed into a high art by the enterprises that specialize in the task. We should not forget Adam Smith's perspicuous observation that the masters of mankind, in his day, the merchants and manufacturers of England, never ceased to pursue their vile maxim, all for ourselves, and nothing for other people. The business counterattack was put on hold during World War II, but quickly revived afterward, with harsh legislation passed restricting workers' rights and an extraordinary propaganda campaign aimed at factories, schools, churches, and every other form of association. Every available means of communication was employed. By the 1980s, with the bitterly anti-labor Reagan administration, the attack was again underway in full force. President Reagan made it clear to the business world that the laws protecting labor rights, never very strong, would not be enforced. The illegal firing of union organizers skyrocketed, and the United States returned to the use of scabs, outlawed almost everywhere in developed countries except South Africa. The liberal Clinton administration undermined labor in different ways. One highly effective means was the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, linking Canada, Mexico, and the United States. For propaganda purposes, NAFTA was labeled a free trade agreement. It was nothing of the sort. Like other such agreements, it had strong protectionist elements, and much of it was not about trade at all. It was an investors' rights agreement. And like other such free trade agreements, this one predictably proved harmful to working people in the participating countries. One effect was to undermine labor organizing. A study conducted under NAFTA auspices revealed that successful organizing declined sharply, thanks to such practices as management warnings that if an enterprise were unionized, it would be transferred to Mexico. Such practices are, of course, illegal, but that is irrelevant as long as business can count on the indispensable government support to which Montgomery referred. By such means, private sector unions were driven down to less than 7% of the workforce, despite the fact that most working people prefer unions. The attack then turned to public sector unions that had been somewhat protected by legislation. That unraveling is now fiercely underway, and not for the first time. We may recall that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968 while supporting a strike of public sector workers in Memphis, Tennessee. In many respects, the condition of working people when war wrote was similar to what we see today, as inequality has again reached the astonishing heights of the late 1920s. For a tiny minority, wealth has accumulated beyond the dreams of avarice. In the past decade, 95% of growth has gone into the pockets of 1% of the population, mostly a fraction of these. Median real income is below its level of 25 years ago. For males, median real income is below what it was in 1968. The labor share of output has fallen to its lowest level since World War II. This is not the result of the mysterious workings of the market or economic laws, but, again, largely of the indispensable support and initiative of a government that is significantly in corporate hands. The American Industrial Revolution, where observed, created one of the major notes of American life in the 1840s and 1850s. While its ultimate outcome may be pleasing enough in modern eyes, it was repugnant to an astonishingly large section of the earlier American community. Where reviews the hideous working conditions imposed on formerly independent craftsmen and farmers, as well as the factory girls, young women from the farms working in the textile mills around Boston. But his primary focus is on more fundamental features of the revolution that persisted even as specific conditions were ameliorated in the course of dedicated struggles over many years. Where emphasized the degradation suffered by the industrial worker, the loss of status and independence that had been their most treasured possession as free citizens of the Republic, a loss that could not be compensated for even by material improvement. He explores the devastating impact of the radical capitalist social revolution in which sovereignty in economic affairs passed from the community as a whole into the keeping of a special class of masters, a group alien to the producers and generally remote from production. He shows that for every protest against machine industry, there can be found 100 against the new power of capitalist production and its discipline. Workers were striking not just for bread but for roses, to borrow the traditional labor slogan. They sought dignity and independence, recognition of their rights as free men and women. They created a lively and independent labor press, written and produced by those who toiled in the mills. In their journals, they condemned the blasting influence of monarchical principles on democratic soil. They recognized that this assault on elementary human rights would not be overcome until they who work in the mills own them, and sovereignty returns to free producers. Then working people will no longer be menials or the humble subjects of a foreign despot, the absentee owners, slaves in the strictest sense of the word, who toil for their masters. Rather, they will regain their status as free American citizens. The capitalist revolution instituted a crucial change from price to wage. When the producer sold his product for a price where rights, he retained his person. But when he came to sell his labor, he sold himself, and lost his dignity as a person as he became a wage slave, the term commonly used. Wage labor was considered similar to chattel slavery, though differing in that it was temporary, in theory. That understanding was so widespread that it became a slogan of the Republican Party, advocated by its leading figure, Abraham Lincoln. The concept that productive enterprises should be owned by the workforce was common coin in the mid-19th century, not just by Marx and the left, but also by the most prominent classical liberal figure of the day, John Stuart Mill. Mill held that the form of association, however, which if mankind continue to improve, must be expected to predominate is the association of the laborers themselves on terms of equality, collectively owning the capital with which they carry on their operations, and working under managers electable and removable by themselves. The concept indeed has solid roots in insights that animated classical liberal thought. It is a short step to link it to control of other institutions and of communities within a framework of free association and federal organization, in the general style of a range of thought that includes, along with much of the anarchist tradition and left anti-Bolshevik Marxism, also G.D.H. Cole's Guild socialism and much more recent theoretical work. And still more significantly, it includes actions as workers in many walks of life seek to gain control over their lives and fate. To undermine these subversive doctrines, it was necessary for the masters of mankind to try to change the attitudes and beliefs that foster them. As were reports, labor activists warned of the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self, the vile maxim of the masters, which they naturally sought to impose on their subjects as well, knowing that they would be able to gain very little of the available wealth. In sharp reaction to this demeaning spirit, the rising movements of working people and radical farmers, the most significant democratic popular movements in American history, were dedicated to solidarity and mutual aid. They were defeated, mostly by force. But the battle is far from over, despite setbacks, often violent repression, and massive efforts to instill the vile maxim in the public mind, with the resources of educational systems, the huge advertising industry, and other propaganda institutions dedicated to the task. There are serious barriers to overcome in the struggle for justice, freedom, and dignity, even beyond the bitter class war conducted ceaselessly by the highly class-conscious business world with the indispensable support of the governments they largely control. Ware discusses some of these insidious threats as they were understood by working people. He reports the thinking of skilled workers in New York 170 years ago, who repeated the common view that a daily wage is a form of slavery and warned perceptively that a day might come when wage slaves will so far forget what is due to manhood as to glory in a system forced on them by their necessity and in opposition to their feelings of independence and self-respect. They hoped that that day would be far distant. Today, signs of it are common, but demands for independence, self-respect, personal dignity, and control of one's own work and life, like Marx's old mole, continue to burrow not far from the surface, ready to reappear when awakened by circumstances and militant activism. Chapter 13. Whose security? How Washington protects itself and the corporate sector. The question of how foreign policy is determined is a crucial one in world affairs. In these comments, I can only provide a few hints as to how I think the subject can be productively explored, keeping to the United States for several reasons. First, the United States is unmatched in its global significance and impact. Second, it is an unusually open society, possibly uniquely so, which means we know more about it. Finally, it is plainly the most important case for Americans, who are able to influence policy choices in the United States, and indeed for others, insofar as their actions can influence such choices. The general principles, however, extend to the other major powers and well beyond. There is a received standard version, common to academic scholarship, government pronouncements, and public discourse. It holds that the prime commitment of governments is to ensure security, and that the primary concern of the United States and its allies from 1945 was the Russian threat. There are a number of ways to evaluate this doctrine. One obvious question to ask is, what happened when the Russian threat disappeared in 1989? The answer: everything continued much as before. The United States immediately invaded Panama, killing possibly thousands of people and installing a client regime. This was routine practice in U.S.-dominated domains, but in this case, not quite as routine. For the first time, a major foreign policy act was not justified by an alleged Russian threat. Instead, a series of fraudulent pretexts for the invasion were concocted that collapsed instantly on examination. The media chimed in enthusiastically, lauding the magnificent achievement of defeating Panama, unconcerned that the pretexts were ludicrous, that the act itself was a radical violation of international law, and that it was bitterly condemned elsewhere, most harshly in Latin America. Also ignored was the U.S. veto of a unanimous Security Council resolution condemning crimes by U.S. troops during the invasion, with Britain alone abstaining. All routine. And all forgotten, which is also routine. From El Salvador to the Russian border. The administration of George H.W. Bush issued a new national security policy and defense budget in reaction to the collapse of the global enemy. It was pretty much the same as before, although with new pretexts. It was, it turned out, necessary to maintain a military establishment almost as great as the rest of the world combined and far more advanced in technological sophistication, but not for defense against the disappearing Soviet Union. Rather, the excuse was the growing technological sophistication of third world powers. Disciplined intellectuals understood that it would have been improper to collapse in ridicule, so they maintained a proper silence. The United States, the new policy insisted, must maintain its defense industrial base. The phrase is a euphemism, referring to high-tech industry generally, which relies heavily on extensive state intervention for research and development, often under Pentagon cover, in what many economists continue to call the U.S. free market economy. One of the most interesting provisions of the new plans had to do with the Middle East. There, it was declared, Washington must maintain intervention forces targeting a crucial region where the major problems could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. Contrary to 50 years of deceit, it was quietly conceded that the main concern in this region was not the Russians, but rather what is called radical nationalism, meaning independent nationalism not under U.S. control. All of this has evident bearing on the received standard version, but it passed unnoticed, or, perhaps, therefore it passed unnoticed. Other important events took place immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, ending the Cold War. One was in El Salvador, the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, apart from Israel and Egypt, a separate category, and with one of the worst human rights records anywhere. That is a familiar and very close correlation. The Salvadoran High Command ordered the Atlacatal Battalion to invade the Jesuit University and murder 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, all Jesuit priests, including the rector, Father Ignacio Ellacuria, and any witnesses, meaning their housekeeper and her daughter. The battalion had already left a bloody trail of thousands of the usual victims in the course of the U.S.-run state terror campaign in El Salvador, part of a broader terror and torture campaign throughout the region. All routine, ignored, and virtually forgotten in the United States and by its allies, again routine. But it tells us a lot about the factors that drive policy, if we care to look at the real world. Another important event took place in Europe. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to allow the reunification of Germany and its membership in NATO, a hostile military alliance. In light of recent history, this was a most astonishing concession. There was a quid pro quo. President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker agreed that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, meaning into East Germany. Instantly, they expanded NATO to East Germany. Gorbachev was naturally outraged, but when he complained, he was instructed by Washington that this had only been a verbal promise, a gentleman's agreement, hence without force. 5 If he was naive enough to accept the word of American leaders, it was his problem. All of this, too, was routine, as was the silent acceptance and approval of the expansion of NATO in the United States and the West generally. President Bill Clinton then expanded NATO right up to Russia's borders. Today, the world faces a serious crisis that is in no small measure a result of these policies. The appeal of plundering the poor. Another source of evidence is the declassified historical record. It contains revealing accounts of the actual motives of state policy. The story is rich and complex, but a few persistent themes play a dominant role. One was articulated clearly at a Western Hemispheric conference called by the United States in Mexico in February 1945, where Washington imposed an economic charter of the Americas designed to eliminate economic nationalism in all its forms. There was one unspoken exception: economic nationalism would be fine for the United States, whose economy relies heavily on massive state intervention. The elimination of economic nationalism for others stood in sharp conflict with the Latin American stand of that moment, which State Department officials described as the philosophy of the new nationalism, that embraces policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses. 7 As U.S. policy analysts added, Latin Americans are convinced that the first beneficiaries of the development of a country's resources should be the people of that country. That, of course, will not do. Washington understands that the first beneficiaries should be U.S. investors, while Latin America fulfills its service function. It should not, as both the Truman and Eisenhower administrations would make clear, undergo excessive industrial development that might infringe on U.S. interests. Thus Brazil could produce low-quality steel that U.S. corporations did not want to bother with, but it would be excessive were it to compete with U.S. firms. Similar concerns resonate throughout the post-World War II period. The global system that was to be dominated by the United States was threatened by what internal documents call radical and nationalistic regimes that responded to popular pressures for independent development. That was the concern that motivated the overthrow of the parliamentary governments of Iran and Guatemala in 1953 and 1954, as well as numerous others. In the case of Iran, a major concern was the potential impact of Iranian independence on Egypt, then in turmoil over British colonial practices. In Guatemala, apart from the crime of the new democracy in empowering the peasant majority and infringing on possessions of the United Fruit Company, already offensive enough, Washington's concern was labor unrest and popular mobilization in neighboring U.S.-backed dictatorships. In both cases, the consequences reach to the present. Literally not a day has passed since 1953 when the United States has not been torturing the people of Iran. Guatemala remains one of the world's worst horror chambers. To this day, Mayans are fleeing from the effects of near-genocidal government military campaigns in the highlands, backed by President Ronald Reagan and his top officials. As the country director of Oxfam, a Guatemalan doctor, reported in 2014, there is a dramatic deterioration of the political, social, and economic context. Attacks against human rights defenders have increased 300% during the last year. There is a clear evidence of a very well-organized strategy by the private sector and army. Both have captured the government in order to keep the status quo and to impose the extraction economical model, pushing away dramatically indigenous peoples from their own land due to the mining industry, African palm and sugar cane plantations. In addition, the social movement defending their land and rights has been criminalized, many leaders are in jail and many others have been killed. Nothing is known about this in the United States, and the very obvious cause of it remains suppressed. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles explained quite clearly the dilemma that the United States faced. They complained that the communists had an unfair advantage. They were able to appeal directly to the masses and get control of mass movements, something we have no capacity to duplicate. The poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. That causes problems. The United States somehow finds it difficult to appeal to the poor with its doctrine that the rich should plunder the poor. The Cuban example. A clear illustration of the general pattern was Cuba, when it finally gained independence in 1959. Within months, military attacks on the island began. Shortly after, the Eisenhower administration made a secret decision to overthrow the government. John F. Kennedy then became president. He intended to devote more attention to Latin America, and so, on taking office, he created a study group to develop policies that was headed by the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., who summarized its conclusions for the incoming president. As Schlesinger explained, what was threatening in an independent Cuba was the Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands. It was an idea that unfortunately appealed to the mass of the population in Latin America, where the distribution of land and other forms of national wealth greatly favors the propertied classes, and the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution, are now demanding opportunities for a decent living. Again, Washington's usual dilemma. As the CIA explained, the extensive influence of Castroism is not a function of Cuban power. Castro's shadow looms large because social and economic conditions throughout Latin America invite opposition to ruling authority and encourage agitation for radical change, for which his Cuba provided a model. Kennedy feared that Russian aid might make Cuba a showcase for development, giving the Soviets the upper hand throughout Latin America. The State Department policy planning staff warned that the primary danger we face in Castro is, in the impact the very existence of his regime has upon the leftist movement in many Latin American countries. The simple fact is that Castro represents a successful defiance of the United States, a negation of our whole hemispheric policy of almost a century and a half, that is, since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, when the United States declared its intention of dominating the hemisphere. The immediate goal at the time of the doctrine was to conquer Cuba, but that could not be achieved because of the power of the British enemy. Still, that grand strategist John Quincy Adams, the intellectual father of the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, informed his colleagues that over time Cuba would fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation, as an apple falls from the tree. In brief, U.S. power would increase and Britain's would decline. In 1898, Adams's prognosis was realized. The United States invaded Cuba in the guise of liberating it. In fact, it prevented the island's liberation from Spain and turned it into a virtual colony, to quote historians Ernest May and Philip Zelikow. Cuba remained a virtual U.S. colony until January 1959, when it gained independence. Since that time it has been subjected to major U.S. terrorist wars, primarily during the Kennedy years, and economic strangulation, and not because of the Russians. The pretense all along was that we were defending ourselves from the Russian threat, an absurd explanation that generally went unchallenged. A simple test of the thesis, again, is what happened when any conceivable Russian threat disappeared. U.S. policy toward Cuba became even harsher, spearheaded by liberal Democrats, including Bill Clinton, who outflanked Bush from the right in the 1992 election. The virus of nationalism. Henry Kissinger caught the essence of the real foreign policy of the United States when he termed independent nationalism a virus that might spread contagion. Kissinger was referring to Salvador Allende's Chile. The virus was the idea that there might be a parliamentary path towards some kind of socialist democracy. The way to deal with such a threat was to destroy the virus and inoculate those who might be infected, typically by imposing murderous national security states. That was achieved in the case of Chile, but it is important to recognize that the thinking held, and still holds, worldwide. It was, for example, the reasoning behind the decision to oppose Vietnamese nationalism in the early 1950s and support France's effort to reconquer its former colony. It was feared that independent Vietnamese nationalism might be a virus that would spread contagion to the surrounding regions, including resource-rich Indonesia. That might even have led Japan to become the industrial and commercial center of an independent new order of the kind Imperial Japan had so recently fought to establish. The remedy was clear and largely achieved. Vietnam was virtually destroyed and ringed by military dictatorships that kept the virus from spreading contagion. The same was true in Latin America in the same years. One virus after another was viciously attacked and either destroyed or weakened to the point of bare survival. From the early 1960s, a plague of repression was imposed on the continent that had no precedent in the violent history of the hemisphere, extending to Central America in the 1980s, a matter that there should be no need to review. Much the same was true in the Middle East. The unique U.S. relations with Israel were established in their current form in 1967 when Israel delivered a smashing blow to Egypt, the center of secular Arab nationalism. By doing so, it protected U.S. ally Saudi Arabia, then engaged in military conflict with Egypt in Yemen. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the most extreme radical fundamentalist Islamic state, and also a missionary state, expending huge sums to establish its Wahhabi Salafi doctrines beyond its borders. It is worth remembering that the United States, like England before it, has tended to support radical fundamentalist Islam in opposition to secular nationalism, which has until recently been perceived as posing more of a threat of independence and contagion. The value of secrecy. There is much more to say, but the historical record demonstrates very clearly that the standard doctrine has little merit. Security in the normal sense is not a prominent factor in policy formation. To repeat, in the normal sense. But in evaluating the standard doctrine, we have to ask what is actually meant by security. Security for whom? One answer is security for state power. There are many illustrations. In May 2014, for example, the United States agreed to support a UN Security Council resolution calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes in Syria, but with a proviso: there could be no inquiry into possible war crimes by Israel or by Washington. Though it was unnecessary to add that last condition, the United States is uniquely self-immunized from the international legal system. In fact, there is even congressional legislation authorizing the president to use armed force to rescue any American brought to The Hague for trial, the Netherlands Invasion Act, as it is sometimes called in Europe. That once again illustrates the importance of protecting the security of state power. But protecting it from whom? There is, in fact, a strong case to be made that a prime concern of government is the security of state power from the population. As those who have spent time rummaging through archives should be aware, government secrecy is rarely motivated by a genuine need for security, but it definitely does serve to keep the population in the dark. And for good reasons, which were lucidly explained by prominent liberal scholar and government advisor Samuel Huntington. In his words, the architects of power in the United States must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate. Huntington wrote that in 1981, when the Cold War was again heating up, and he explained further that you may have to sell, intervention or other military action, in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting. That is what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine. These simple truths are rarely acknowledged, but they provide insight into state power and policy, with reverberations to the present moment. State power has to be protected from its domestic enemy. In sharp contrast, the population is not secure from state power. A striking illustration is the radical attack on the Constitution by the Obama administration's massive surveillance program. It is, of course, justified by national security. That is routine for virtually all actions of all states and so carries little information. When the NSA's surveillance program was exposed by Edward Snowden's revelations, high officials claimed that it had prevented 54 terrorist acts. On inquiry, that was whittled down to a dozen. A high-level government panel then discovered that there was actually only one case: someone had sent $8,500 to Somalia. That was the total yield of the huge assault on the Constitution and, of course, on others throughout the world. Britain's attitude is interesting. In 2007, the British government called on Washington's colossal spy agency to analyze and retain any British citizens' mobile phone and fax numbers, emails, and IP addresses swept up by its dragnet, The Guardian reported. That is a useful indication of the relative significance, in government eyes, of the privacy of its own citizens and of Washington's demands. Another concern is security for private power. One illustration is the huge trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic Pacts, now being negotiated. These are being negotiated in secret, but not completely in secret. They are not secret from the hundreds of corporate lawyers who are drawing up the detailed provisions. It is not hard to guess what the results will be, and the few leaks about them suggest that the expectations are accurate. Like NAFTA and other such pacts, these are not free trade agreements. In fact, they are not even trade agreements, but primarily investor rights agreements. Again, secrecy is critically important to protect the primary domestic constituency of the governments involved, the corporate sector. The final century of human civilization? There are other examples too numerous to mention, facts that are well established and would be taught in elementary schools in free societies. There is, in other words, ample evidence that securing state power from the domestic population and securing concentrated private power are driving forces in policy formation. Of course, it is not quite that simple. There are interesting cases, some quite current, where these commitments conflict, but we can consider this to be a good first approximation, and one radically opposed to the received standard doctrine. Let us turn to another question. What about the security of the population? It is easy to demonstrate that this is of marginal concern to policy planners. Take two prominent current examples: global warming and nuclear weapons. As any literate person is doubtless aware, these are dire threats to the security of the population. Turning to state policy, we find that it is committed to accelerating each of those threats, in the interests of its primary concerns: protection of state power and of the concentrated private power that largely determines state policy. Consider global warming. There is now much exuberance in the United States about 100 years of energy independence as we become the Saudi Arabia of the next century, perhaps the final century of human civilization if current policies persist. That illustrates very clearly the nature of the concern for security, certainly not for the population. It also illustrates the moral calculus of contemporary state capitalism. The fate of our grandchildren counts as nothing when compared with the imperative of higher profits tomorrow. These conclusions are fortified by a closer look at the propaganda system. There is a huge public relations campaign in the United States, organized quite openly by big energy and the business world, to try to convince the public that global warming is either unreal or not a result of human activity. And it has had some impact. The United States ranks lower than other countries in public concern about global warming, and the results are stratified. Among Republicans, the party more fully dedicated to the interests of wealth and corporate power, it ranks far lower than the global norm. The premier journal of media criticism, the Columbia Journalism Review, had an interesting article on the subject attributing this outcome to the media doctrine of fair and balanced. In other words, if a journal publishes an opinion piece reflecting the conclusions of 97% of scientists, it must also run a counterpiece expressing the viewpoint of the energy corporations. That indeed is what happens, but there certainly is no fair and balanced doctrine. Thus, if a journal runs an opinion piece denouncing Russian President Vladimir Putin for the criminal act of taking over the Crimea, it surely does not have to run a piece pointing out that, while the act is indeed criminal, Russia has a far stronger case today than the United States did more than a century ago in taking over southeastern Cuba, including Guantanamo, the country's major port, and rejecting the Cuban demand since independence to have it returned. And the same is true of many other cases. The actual media doctrine is fair and balanced when the concerns of concentrated private power are involved, but surely not elsewhere. On the issue of nuclear weapons, the record is similarly interesting and frightening. It reveals very clearly that, from the earliest days, the security of the population was a non-issue, and remains so. There is no need here to run through the shocking record, but there is little doubt that policymakers have been playing roulette with the fate of the species. As we are all surely aware, we now face the most ominous decisions in human history. There are many problems that must be addressed, but two are overwhelming in their significance: environmental destruction and nuclear war. For the first time in history, we face the possibility of destroying the prospects for decent existence, and not in the distant future. For this reason alone, it is imperative to sweep away the ideological clouds and face honestly and realistically the question of how policy decisions are made, and what we can do to alter them before it is too late. Chapter 14. Outrage. Almost every day brings news of awful crimes, but some are so heinous, so horrendous and malicious, that they dwarf all else. One of those rare events took place when Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down in eastern Ukraine, killing 298 people. The guardian of virtue in the White House denounced it as an outrage of unspeakable proportions, which he attributed to Russian support. His UN ambassador thundered that when 298 civilians are killed in the horrific downing of a civilian plane, we must stop at nothing to determine who is responsible and to bring them to justice. She also called on Vladimir Putin to end his shameful efforts to evade his very clear responsibility. True, the irritating little man with the rat-like face, as Timothy Garton Ash described him, had called for an independent investigation, but that could only have been because of sanctions from the one country courageous enough to impose them, the United States, while Europeans cowered in fear. On CNN, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor assured the world that the irritating little man is clearly responsible for the shoot-down of this airliner. For weeks, lead stories reported on the anguish of the families, the lives of the murdered victims, the international efforts to claim the bodies, and the fury over the horrific crime that stunned the world, as the press reported daily in grisly detail. Every literate person, and certainly every editor and commentator, should instantly have recalled another case when a plane was shot down with comparable loss of life, Iran Air Flight 655, with 290 killed, including 66 children, shot down in Iranian airspace on a clearly identified commercial air route. The agent of this act has always been known. It was the guided missile cruiser USS Vincennes, operating in Iranian waters in the Persian Gulf. The commander of a nearby U.S. vessel, David Carlson, wrote in the U.S. Naval Institute's magazine, Profdings, that he wondered aloud in disbelief as the Vincennes announced her intentions to attack what was clearly a civilian aircraft. He speculated that robo-cruiser, as the Vincennes was called because of its aggressive behavior, felt a need to prove the viability of Aegis, the sophisticated anti-aircraft system on the cruiser, in the Persian Gulf, and that they hankered for the opportunity to show their stuff. 2 years later, the commander of the Vincennes and the officer in charge of anti-air warfare were given the U.S. Legion of Merit Award for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service and for the calm and professional atmosphere maintained during the period around the downing of the Iranian Airbus. The airplane's destruction itself was not mentioned in the award. President Ronald Reagan blamed the Iranians for the disaster and defended the actions of the warship, which followed standing orders and widely publicized procedures, firing to protect itself against possible attack. His successor, George H. W. Bush, proclaimed that I will never apologize for the United States, I don't care what the facts are. I'm not an apologize for America kind of guy. No evasions of responsibility here, unlike the barbarians in the East. There was little reaction at the time, no outrage, no desperate search for victims, no passionate denunciations of those responsible, no eloquent laments by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations about the immense and heart-wrenching loss when the airliner was downed. Iranian condemnations were occasionally noted but dismissed as boilerplate attacks on the United States, as Philip Sheehan of the New York Times put it. Small wonder, then, that this insignificant earlier event merited only a few scattered words in the U.S. media during the vast furor over a real crime, in which the demonic enemy might have been indirectly involved. One exception was the London Daily Mail, where Dominic Lawson wrote that although Putin's apologists might bring up the Iran air attack, the comparison actually demonstrates our high moral values as contrasted with those of the miserable Russians, who try to evade their responsibility for MH17 with lies while Washington at once announced that the U.S. warship had shot down the Iranian aircraft, righteously. What more powerful evidence could there be of our nobility and their depravity? We know why Ukrainians and Russians are in their own countries, but one might ask what exactly the Vinfens was doing in Iranian waters. The answer is simple: it was defending Washington's great friend Saddam Hussein in his murderous aggression against Iran. For the victims, the shoot-down was no small matter. It was a major factor in Iran's recognition that it could not fight on any longer, according to historian Dilip Hero. It is worth remembering the extent of Washington's devotion to its friend Saddam. Reagan removed him from the State Department's terrorist list so that aid could be sent to expedite his assault on Iran, and later both denied his terrible crimes against the Kurds, including the use of chemical weapons, and blocked congressional condemnations of those crimes. He also accorded Saddam a privilege otherwise granted only to Israel. There was no serious reaction when Iraq attacked the USS Stark with Exocet missiles, killing 37 crewmen, much like the case of the USS Liberty, attacked repeatedly by Israeli jets and torpedo ships in 1967, killing 34 crewmen. Reagan's successor, George H. W. Bush, went on to provide further aid to Saddam, badly needed after the war with Iran that he had launched. Bush also invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to come to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. In April 1990, he dispatched a high-level Senate delegation, led by future Republican presidential candidate Bob Dole, to convey his warm regards to his friend Saddam and to assure him that he should disregard irresponsible criticism from the haughty and pampered press, and that such miscreants had been removed from Voice of America. The fawning before Saddam continued until he suddenly turned into a new Hitler a few months later when he disobeyed orders, or perhaps misunderstood them, and invaded Kuwait, with illuminating consequences that I must leave aside here. Other precedents for MH17 had long since been sent down the memory hole as being without significance. Take, for instance, the Libyan civilian airliner that was lost in a sandstorm in 1973 and shot down by U.S. supplied Israeli jets, 2 minutes flight time from Cairo, toward which it was heading. The death toll was only 110 that time. Israel blamed the French pilot of the Libyan plane, with the endorsement of the New York Times, which added that the Israeli act was, at worst, an act of callousness that not even the savagery of previous Arab actions can excuse. The incident was passed over quickly in the United States, with little criticism. When Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir arrived in Washington 4 days later, she faced few embarrassing questions and returned home with new gifts of military aircraft. The reaction was much the same when Washington's favored Angolan terrorist organization, UNITA, claimed to have shot down 2 civilian airliners. Returning to the sole authentic and truly horrific crime, the New York Times reported that UN Ambassador Samantha Power choked up as she spoke of infants who perished in the Malaysia Airlines crash in Ukraine, and the Dutch Foreign Minister, Frans Timmermans, could barely contain his anger as he recalled seeing pictures of thugs snatching wedding bands off the fingers of the victims. At the same session, the report continues, there was also a long recitation of names and ages, all belonging to children killed in the latest Israeli offensive in Gaza. The only reported reaction was by Palestinian envoy Riyad Mansour, who grew quiet in the middle of the recitation. The Israeli attack on Gaza in July did, however, elicit outrage in Washington. President Obama reiterated his strong condemnation of rocket and tunnel attacks against Israel by the militant group Hamas, The Hill reported. He also expressed growing concern about the rising number of Palestinian civilian deaths in Gaza, but without condemnation. The Senate filled that gap, voting unanimously to support Israeli actions in Gaza while condemning the unprovoked rocket fire at Israel by Hamas and calling on Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to dissolve the unity governing arrangement with Hamas and condemn the attacks on Israel. As for Congress, perhaps it's enough to join the 80% of the public who disapprove of their performance, though the word disapprove is rather too mild in this case. But in Obama's defense, it may be that he has no idea what Israel is doing in Gaza with the weapons that he is kind enough to supply to them. After all, he relies on U.S. intelligence, which may be too busy collecting phone calls and email messages of citizens to pay much attention to such marginalia. It may be useful, then, to review what we all should know. Israel's goal had long been a simple one: quiet for quiet, a return to the norm, though now it may demand even more. What then was the norm? For the West Bank, the norm has been that Israel carries forward its illegal construction of settlements and infrastructure, so that whatever might be of value can be integrated into Israel, while the Palestinians are consigned to unviable cantons and subjected to intense repression and violence. For the past 14 years, the norm has been that Israel kills more than 2 Palestinian children a week. One such recent Israeli rampage was set off on June 12, 2014, by the brutal murder of 3 Israeli boys from a settler community in the occupied West Bank. A month before, 2 Palestinian boys had been shot dead in the West Bank city of Ramallah. That elicited no attention, which is understandable, since it is routine. The institutionalized disregard for Palestinian life in the West helps explain not only why Palestinians resort to violence, the respected Middle East analyst Moin Rabbani reports, but also Israel's latest assault on the Gaza Strip. Its quiet for quiet policy has also enabled Israel to carry forward its program of separating Gaza from the West Bank. That program has been pursued vigorously, always with U.S. support, ever since the United States and Israel accepted the Oslo Accords, which declare the 2 regions to be an inseparable territorial unity. A look at the map explains the rationale. Gaza provides Palestine's only access to the outside world, so once the 2 are separated, any autonomy that Israel might grant to Palestinians in the West Bank would leave them effectively imprisoned between hostile states, Israel and Jordan. The imprisonment will become even more severe as Israel continues its systematic program of expelling Palestinians from the Jordan Valley and constructing Israeli settlements there. The norm in Gaza was described in detail by the heroic Norwegian trauma surgeon Mads Gilbert, who has worked in Gaza's main hospital through Israel's most grotesque crimes and returned again for the current onslaught. In June 2014, immediately before it began, he submitted a report on the Gaza health sector to UNRWA, the UN agency that tries desperately, on a shoestring, to care for refugees. At least 57% of Gaza households are food insecure and about 80% are now aid recipients, Gilbert reported. Food insecurity and rising poverty also mean that most residents cannot meet their daily caloric requirements, while over 90% of the water in Gaza has been deemed unfit for human consumption, a situation that became even worse when Israel again attacked water and sewage systems, leaving over 1 million people with even more severe disruptions of the barest necessities of life. Gilbert further reported that Palestinian children in Gaza are suffering immensely. A large proportion are affected by the man-made malnourishment regime caused by the Israeli-imposed blockage. Prevalence of anemia in children less than 2 years in Gaza is at 72.8%, while prevalence of wasting, stunting, underweight have been documented at 34.3%, 31.4%, 31.45% respectively. And it gets worse as the report proceeds. The distinguished human rights lawyer Raji Sourani, who has remained in Gaza through years of Israeli brutality and terror, reports that the most common sentence I heard when people began to talk about ceasefire, "Everybody says it's better for all of us to die and not go back to the situation we used to have before this war. We don't want that again. We have no dignity, no pride, we are just soft targets, and we are very cheap. Either this situation really improves or it is better to just die." I am talking about intellectuals, academics, ordinary people, everybody is saying that. For Gaza, the plans for the norm were explained forthrightly by Dov Weissglass, a confidant of Ariel Sharon and the person who negotiated the withdrawal of Israeli settlers from Gaza in 2005. Hailed as a grand gesture in Israel and among acolytes, the withdrawal was in reality a carefully staged national trauma, ridiculed by informed Israeli commentators, among them the country's leading sociologist, the late Baruch Kimmerling. What actually happened is that Israeli hawks, led by Sharon, realized that it made good sense to transfer the illegal settlers from their subsidized communities in devastated Gaza, where they were sustained at exorbitant cost, to subsidized settlements in the other occupied territories, which Israel intends to keep. Instead of simply transferring them, as would have been simple enough, it was clearly more useful to present the world with images of little children pleading with soldiers not to destroy their homes, amid cries of "never again," with the implication obvious. What made the farce even more transparent was that it was a replica of the staged trauma when Israel had to evacuate the Egyptian part of the Sinai Peninsula in 1982. But it played very well for the intended audience at home and abroad. Weissglass provided his own description of the transfer of settlers from Gaza to other occupied territories. What I effectively agreed to with the Americans was that the major settlement blocks in the West Bank would not be dealt with at all, and the rest will not be dealt with until the Palestinians turn into Finns, but a special kind of Finns, who would quietly accept rule by a foreign power. The significance is the freezing of the political process, Weissglass continued. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and you prevent a discussion about the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package that is called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed from our agenda indefinitely. And all this with President Bush's authority and permission and the ratification of both houses of Congress. Weissglass explained that Gazans would remain on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger, which would not help Israel's fading reputation. With their vaunted technical efficiency, Israeli experts determined precisely how many calories a day Gazans needed for bare survival, while also depriving them of medicines and other means of a decent life. Israeli military forces confined them by land, sea, and air to what British Prime Minister David Cameron accurately described as a prison camp. The Israeli withdrawal left them in total control of Gaza, hence the occupying power under international law. And to close the prison walls even more tightly, Israel excluded Palestinians from a large region along the border, including a third or more of Gaza's scarce arable land. The justification was security for Israelis, which could have been just as well achieved by establishing the security zone on the Israeli side of the border, or by ending the savage siege and other punishments. The official story is that after Israel graciously handed Gaza over to the Palestinians in the hope that they would construct a flourishing state, they revealed their true nature by subjecting Israel to unremitting rocket attacks and forcing the captive population to become martyrs so that Israel would be pictured in a bad light. Reality is rather different. A few weeks after Israeli troops withdrew, leaving the occupation intact, Palestinians committed a major crime. In January 2006, they voted the wrong way in a carefully monitored free election, handing control of their parliament to Hamas. The Israeli media constantly intoned that Hamas was dedicated to the destruction of the country. In reality, Hamas's leaders have repeatedly made it clear that they would accept a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus that has been blocked by the United States and Israel for 40 years. In contrast, Israel is dedicated to the destruction of Palestine, apart from some occasional meaningless words, and is implementing that commitment. True, Israel accepted the roadmap for reaching a two-state settlement initiated by President Bush and adopted by the quartet that was supposed to supervise it: the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia. But as he accepted the roadmap, Prime Minister Sharon at once added 14 reservations that effectively nullified it. The facts were known to activists, but only revealed to the general public for the first time in Jimmy Carter's book Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. They remain under wraps in media reporting and commentary. The unrevised 1999 platform of Israel's governing party, Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud, flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state west of the Jordan River. And for those who like to obsess about meaningless charters, the core component of Likud, Menachem Begin's Harrop Party, has yet to abandon its founding doctrine that the territory on both sides of the Jordan is part of the land of Israel. The crime of the Palestinians in January 2006 was punished at once. The United States and Israel, with Europe shamefully trailing behind, imposed harsh sanctions on the Arab population, and Israel stepped up its violence. By June, when the attacks sharply escalated, Israel had already fired more than 7,700 shells at northern Gaza. The United States and Israel quickly initiated plans for a military coup to overthrow the elected government. When Hamas had the effrontery to foil these plans, the Israeli assaults and the siege became far more severe, justified by the claim that Hamas had taken over the Gaza Strip by force. There should be no need to review again the horrendous record since. The relentless siege and savage attacks have been punctuated by episodes of mowing the lawn, to borrow Israel's cheery expression for its periodic exercises of shooting fish in a pond in what it calls a war of defense. Once the lawn is mowed and the desperate population seeks to reconstruct somehow from the devastation and the murders, there is a ceasefire agreement. These have been regularly observed by Hamas, as Israel concedes, until Israel violates them with renewed violence. The most recent ceasefire was established after Israel's October 2012 assault. Though Israel maintained its devastating siege, Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israeli officials concede. Matters changed in June, when Fatah and Hamas forged a unity agreement, which established a new government of technocrats that had no Hamas participation and accepted all of the demands of the quartet. Israel was naturally furious, all the more so when even the Obama administration joined in signaling its approval. The unity agreement not only undercut Israel's claim that it cannot negotiate with a divided Palestine, but also threatened the long-term goal of dividing Gaza from the West Bank and pursuing its destructive policies in both regions. Something had to be done, and an occasion arose shortly after, when the 3 Israeli boys were murdered in the West Bank. The Netanyahu government had strong evidence at once that they were dead, but pretended otherwise, which provided the opportunity to launch a rampage in the West Bank, targeting Hamas, undermining the feared unity government, and sharply increasing Israeli repression. Netanyahu claimed to have certain knowledge that Hamas was responsible. That too was a lie, as was recognized early on. There has been no pretense of presenting evidence. One of Israel's leading authorities on Hamas, Shlomi Eldar, reported almost at once that the killers very likely came from a dissident clan in Hebron that has long been a thorn in the side of Hamas. Eldar added, "I'm sure they didn't get any green light from the leadership of Hamas, they just thought it was the right time to act." The 18-day rampage did succeed in undermining the feared unity government and sharply increasing Israeli repression. According to Israeli military sources, Israeli soldiers arrested 419 Palestinians, including 335 affiliated with Hamas, and killed 6, while searching thousands of locations and confiscating $350,000. Israel also conducted dozens of attacks in Gaza, killing 5 Hamas members on July 7. Hamas finally reacted with its first rockets in 19 months, Israeli officials reported, providing the pretext for Operation Protective Edge on July 8. There has been ample reporting on the exploits of the self-declared most moral army in the world, which, according to Israel's ambassador to the United States, should receive the Nobel Peace Prize. By the end of July, some 1,500 Palestinians had been killed, exceeding the toll of the Operation Cast Lead crimes of 2008-9. 70% of them were civilians, including hundreds of women and children. 3 civilians in Israel were also killed. Large areas of Gaza were turned into rubble. During brief pauses in the bombing, relatives desperately sought shattered bodies or household items in the ruins of homes. Gaza's main power plant was attacked, not for the first time. This is an Israeli specialty, sharply curtailing the already limited electricity and, worse yet, reducing still further the minimal availability of fresh water, another war crime. Meanwhile, rescue teams and ambulances were repeatedly attacked. As atrocities mounted throughout Gaza, Israel claimed that its goal was to destroy tunnels at the border. 4 hospitals were attacked, each yet another war crime. The first was the Al-Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital in Gaza City, attacked on the day Israeli ground forces invaded the prison. A few lines in the New York Times, within a story about the ground invasion, reported that most but not all of the 17 patients and 25 doctors and nurses were evacuated before the electricity was cut and heavy bombardments nearly destroyed the building, doctors said. "We evacuated them under fire," said Dr. Ali Abu Riala, a hospital spokesman. Nurses and doctors had to carry the patients on their backs, some of them falling off the stairway. There is an unprecedented state of panic in the hospital. 3 working hospitals were then attacked, while patients and staff were left to their own devices to survive. One Israeli crime did receive wide condemnation: the attack on a UN school that was harboring 3,300 terrified refugees who had fled the ruins of their neighborhoods on the orders of the Israeli army. The outraged UNRWA Commissioner General, Pierre Crayenbull, said, "I condemn in the strongest possible terms this serious violation of international law by Israeli forces. Today the world stands disgraced." There were at least 3 Israeli strikes at the refugee shelter, a site well known to the Israeli army. The precise location of the Jabalia Elementary Girls' School and the fact that it was housing thousands of internally displaced people was communicated to the Israeli army 17 times, to ensure its protection, Crayenbull said, the last being at 10 to 9 last night, just hours before the fatal shelling. The attack was also condemned in the strongest possible terms by the normally reticent Secretary-General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. "Nothing is more shameful than attacking sleeping children," he said. There is no record that the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations choked up as she spoke of infants who perished in the Israeli strike, or in the attack on Gaza altogether. But White House spokesperson Bernadette Meehan did respond. She said that we are extremely concerned that thousands of internally displaced Palestinians who have been called on by the Israeli military to evacuate their homes are not safe in UN-designated shelters in Gaza. We also condemn those responsible for hiding weapons in United Nations facilities in Gaza. She omitted to mention that these facilities were empty and that the weapons were found by UNRWA, who had already condemned those who hid them. Later, the administration joined in stronger condemnations of this particular crime, while at the same time releasing more weapons to Israel. In doing so, however, Pentagon spokesman Steve Warren told reporters, "And it's become clear that the Israelis need to do more to live up to their very high standards for protecting civilian life, the high standards it had been exhibiting for many years while using U.S. arms." Attacks on UN compounds sheltering refugees is another Israeli specialty. One famous incident is the Israeli bombardment of the clearly identified UN refugee shelter in Qana during Shimon Peres's murderous Grapes of Wrath campaign in 1996, killing 106 Lebanese civilians who had taken refuge there, including 52 children. To be sure, Israel is not alone in this practice. 20 years earlier, its ally South Africa launched an airborne strike deep into Angola against Kasinga, a refugee camp run by the Namibian resistant SWAPO. Israeli officials laud the humanity of their army, which even goes so far as to inform residents that their homes will be bombed. The practice is sadism, sanctimoniously disguising itself as mercy, in the words of Israeli journalist Amira Hass, a recorded message demanding hundreds of thousands of people leave their already targeted homes for another place, equally dangerous, 10 kilometers away. In fact, no place in the prison is safe from Israeli sadism. Some find it difficult to profit from Israel's solicitude. An appeal to the world by the Gazan Catholic Church quoted a priest who explained the plight of residents of the House of Christ, a care home dedicated to looking after disabled children. They were removed to the Holy Family Church because Israel was targeting the area. But soon thereafter he wrote, "The Church of Gaza has received an order to evacuate. They will bomb that site and area, and the people are already fleeing." The problem is that the priest Father George and the 3 nuns of Mother Teresa have 29 handicapped children and 9 old ladies who can't move. How will they manage to leave? If anyone can intercede with someone in power and pray, please do it. Actually, it shouldn't have been difficult. Israel already provided the instructions at the Al Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital. And fortunately, at least some states tried to intercede, as best they could. 5 Latin American states, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Peru, withdrew their ambassadors from Israel, following the course of Bolivia and Venezuela, which had broken relations in reaction to earlier Israeli crimes. These principled acts were another sign of the remarkable change in world relations as much of Latin America begins to free itself from Western domination, sometimes providing a model of civilized behavior to those who controlled it for 500 years. The hideous revelations elicited a different reaction from the most moral president in the world, the usual one: great sympathy for Israelis, bitter condemnation of Hamas, and calls for moderation on both sides. In his August press conference, President Obama did express concern for Palestinians caught in the crossfire, while again vigorously supporting the right of Israel to defend itself, like everyone. Not quite everyone, not, of course, Palestinians. They have no right to defend themselves, surely not when Israel is on good behavior, keeping to the norm of quiet for quiet, stealing their land, driving them out of their homes, subjecting them to a savage siege, and regularly attacking them with weapons provided by their protector. Palestinians are like black Africans, the Namibian refugees in the Kasinga camp, for example, all terrorists for whom the right of defense does not exist. A 72-hour humanitarian truce was supposed to go into effect at 8 a.m. on August 1. It broke down almost at once. According to a press release of the Al Mezan Center for Human Rights in Gaza, which has a solid reputation for reliability, one of its field workers in Rafah, at the Egyptian border in the south, heard Israeli artillery firing at about 8:05 a.m. By about 9:30 a.m., after reports that an Israeli soldier had been captured, intensive air and artillery bombing of Rafah was underway, killing probably dozens of people and injuring hundreds who had returned to their homes after the ceasefire entered into effect. The numbers could not be verified. The day before, on July 31, the coastal municipality's water utility, the sole provider of water in the Gaza Strip, had announced that it could no longer provide water or sanitation services because of lack of fuel and frequent attacks on its personnel. The Al Mezan Center for Human Rights reported that by then, almost all primary health services had stopped in the Gaza Strip due to the lack of water, garbage collection, and environment health services. UNRWA had also warned about the risk of imminent spreading of disease owing to the halt of water and sanitation services. Meanwhile, on the eve of the ceasefire, Israeli missiles fired from aircraft continued to kill and wound victims throughout the region. When the current episode of sadism is finally called off, whenever that will be, Israel hopes to be free to pursue its criminal policies in the occupied territories without interference. Gazans will be free to return to the norm in their Israeli-run prison, while in the West Bank they can watch in peace as Israel dismantles what remains of their possessions. That is the likely outcome if the United States maintains its decisive and virtually unilateral support for Israeli crimes and its rejection of the long-standing international consensus on diplomatic settlement. But the future would be quite different if the United States withdraws that support. In that case, it might be possible to move toward the enduring solution in Gaza that Secretary of State John Kerry called for, eliciting hysterical condemnation in Israel because the phrase could be interpreted as calling for an end to Israel's siege and regular attacks, and, horror of horrors, the phrase might even be interpreted as calling for implementation of international law in the rest of the occupied territories. It is not that Israel's security would be threatened by adherence to international law. It would likely be enhanced. But as explained 40 years ago by Israeli General and later President Ezer Weizman, Israel could not then exist according to the scale, spirit, and quality she now embodies. There are similar cases in recent history. Indonesian generals swore that they would never abandon what Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans called the Indonesian province of East Timor as he was making a deal to steal Timorese oil. As long as the ruling generals retained U.S. support through decades of virtually genocidal slaughter, their goals were realistic. Finally, in September 1999, under considerable domestic and international pressure, President Clinton informed them quietly that the game was over and they instantly withdrew from East Timor, while Evans turned to a new career as the lauded apostle of responsibility to protect, in a version designed, of course, to permit a Western resort to violence at will. Another relevant case is South Africa. In 1958, South Africa's foreign minister informed the U.S. ambassador that although his country was becoming a pariah state, it would not matter as long as Washington's support continued. His assessment proved fairly accurate. 30 years later, Ronald Reagan was the last significant holdout in supporting the apartheid regime, which was still sustaining itself. Within a few years, Washington joined the world and the regime collapsed, not for that reason alone, of course. One crucial factor was the remarkable Cuban role in the liberation of Africa, generally ignored in the West, though not in Africa. 40 years ago, Israel made the fateful decision to choose expansion over security, rejecting a full peace treaty offered by Egypt in return for the evacuation of occupied Egyptian Sinai, where Israel was initiating extensive settlement and development projects. It has adhered to that policy ever since, making essentially the same judgment as South Africa did in 1958. In the case of Israel, if the United States decided to join the world, the impact would be far greater. Relations of power allow nothing else, as has been demonstrated whenever Washington has seriously demanded that Israel abandon one of its cherished goals. By now, Israel has little recourse, having adopted policies that turned it from a greatly admired country to one feared and despised, a course it continues to pursue with blind determination in its resolute march toward moral deterioration and possible ultimate destruction. Could U.S. policy change? It's not impossible. Public opinion has shifted considerably in recent years, particularly among the young, and it cannot be completely ignored. For some years, there has been a good basis for public demands that Washington observe its own laws and cut off military aid to Israel. U.S. law requires that no security assistance may be provided to any country the government of which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. Israel most certainly is guilty of such a consistent pattern. That is why Amnesty International, in the course of Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, called for an arms embargo against Israel as well as Hamas. Senator Patrick Leahy, author of this provision of the law, has brought up its potential applicability to Israel in specific cases, and with a well-conducted educational, organizational, and activist effort such initiatives might be pursued successfully. 53 That could have a very significant impact in itself, while also providing a springboard for further actions not only to punish Israel for its criminal behavior, but also to compel Washington to become part of the international community and observe international law and decent moral principles. Nothing could be more significant for the tragic Palestinian victims of many years of violence and repression.